Thank you for telling us about the inner workings of Sunrise Movement. Where and how, when did you get involved in Sunrise?
I got involved in late November of 2018. It was following the first Nancy Pelosi sit-in that came immediately after the midterm election, but right before the second one.
And what got you involved?
So at the time, we were doing like mass calls that were only like 200 people. And so I hopped on a mass call after seeing them on Twitter. And actually, somebody connected with me on there and convinced me to come to the second sit-in in DC.
It seems to me that Sunrise has the most sophisticated, thoughtful organizational structure. Do you think that's overstated, or do you agree with that?
Yeah, so we're a movement like grounded in momentum, organizing, values, and structure. And so I think certainly um, we marry like a decentralized movement with real like organized structures, as do most momentum movements. And so I think sometimes in contrast to like fully decentralized movements like perhaps XR or like really Occupy is like the best example of a fully decentralized movement. We appear to have more of a structure because we really intentionally set that.
For people who don't know about Momentum Institute training, tell us a little bit about their background and how Sunrise has utilized it.
Yeah, so I could not adequately tell you about how momentum evolved, but I will say that we initially front-loaded with support from Momentum in 2016, and we are front-loading right now, so like reevaluating our structure and story and strategy through their support once again, with other momentum-based movements such as, I want to say, I'm like 90% sure If Not Now is another strong example, but I am not 100% sure of that.
That which one is
If Not Now is also like an example of a momentum based organization.
What's their purpose? I haven't heard of them.
If Not Now is young Jews against the occupation. So like really a strong part of the BDS movement. I don't know a ton about If Not Now as well. I found enough Jews in Sunrise.
For people who don't know, that it's a boycott movement against Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands, and
Yes.
Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo are trying to outlaw it and say you can't boycott Israel.
Yes, but yeah, we know that is not true, and that you most certainly can and should.
Right. They come up with very interesting twists of logic, like Trump says, I won the election, and the Democrats was a fraud, no evidence, and a majority of his followers believe it. I do not get it.
That is the right-wing propaganda machine working its best.
But why, if there's no evidence, why do you think so many millions of people accept just because he says it? Is it our educational system? I mean, there's a flaw somewhere.
You know, I'm reading this book called Power and Powerlessness. Maybe it's like right here in my stack. No, I think it's in my room. But it's a history of like movement building and the lack of in Appalachia. And I think something really interesting that I was reading about the other night was like three-dimensional power. And when we think of three-dimensional power, it's like all of our traditional notions of power taken one step further to the point where, like, just speaking from personal experience, like, power is so heavily ingrained that folks are unable to even see the flaws in the system or see that they are disempowered in the first place. And I think that, like, that is really an example of, like, specifically thinking about my community, in Appalachia, like, who voted so heavily for Trump, right? It's like, I get really annoyed when people say, like, oh, they're voting against their best interests. because that puts the onus on the individuals, as opposed to a system that has warped their sense of what interest is and like who controls that, and like their sense of power and agency has been completely taken. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think like people are really seeking for any kind of power outside of the system right now, and Trump represented populism and like harnessed populism in a way that the left has like radically failed to, and I mean also harnessed white supremacy and like ingrained notions of superiority. But yeah, I don't know. I have many amalgamous blob thoughts on that.
You know what this makes me think of is Gandhi said we give at least our tacit consent to be ruled, and that to like change the colonial mindset and be able to overthrow the British, they have to change their permission. So that we give consent on some level.
Absolutely. And I will say, thinking back to Sunrise Strategy, I have not read a ton of Gandhi and am working on remedying that. But I know that Gandhi was a really integral part of initial conversations and thinking about consent and agency and empowerment. And it's something that we're revisiting because there are continually lessons to learn from him and the movement as a whole.
So if you were doing like a Momentum Training Institute 101, what are some of the basic principles that they say if you're going to be successful as a social movement, you need to think of blah, blah, and blah?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing I think about a lot is like the way that we think about like playing the outside game, right? So if we think about changing dominant institutions, which is ultimately what Sunrise is trying to do, we're trying to change dominant institutions and like stop climate change. And I think that there are like two fundamental ways that you change those institutions. It's like by playing the inside game, by lobbying, et cetera, by being a part of that system. Maybe lobbying is even an outside game, actually, but like really being a full-blown part of that system and institution and being outside of it. And I think like when we think of being outside of it, there are like two kind of components, and both of those are present in a momentum-based movement as opposed to choosing one end of the spectrum or another. And those two components are like structure-based organizing and mass protest. And so when we think of mass protest, we think of like Occupy Wall Street, of like fully decentralized movements. And like labor unions are one of the best examples of like very like structure-based organizing. And I think momentum organizations successfully marry those two principles to differing degrees, of course, right? Like I would say in many ways, Sunrise is far more decentralized than they are structure-based, or mass protest, excuse me, because there is the difference. But yeah, marrying those two is like the number one thing that I think of. I think that's like really the biggest distinction in my mind.
Okay. So Sunrise was founded in June 2017 by 12 young people. And I think that that Varshini how do you say her name?
Varshini Prakash.
She had a history in trying to get rid of the divesting from her University of Massachusetts endowment fund. So she came out of the divestment movement. What else propelled her and the 12 to organize a new organization that you know of?
Yeah. So a lot of our leaders came out of like divestment movements and also like kind of the modern culture of the environmental movement. But I think there were a few things. One was like, it was very, very clear that to stop climate change at the timeline that we knew was necessary, it was going to take a kind of mobilization that other movements were simply failing to do, especially a mobilization of young people. And there wasn't really a bold or progressive vision that any of, I think, environmentally focused movements for change had put forth at the time, right? There was no intersectional vision of like what society could look like once we stopped climate change. And so I think it was those two things were really integral components. I also think like looking at the gaps of the divestment movement, looking to like the environmental justice movement, and all of these different movements, I do think that there was also fundamentally a clear lack of like agency with young people, and like they had not been mobilized in the ways that we knew would be necessary or could be powerful to stop climate change and like to ring in this vision of a new world, of a new society. And so and I think that there are other like subsequent distinctions. We really intentionally created a culture of like storytelling and singing and thinking back to movements for change from the 20th century and even further back. And so I think that I think there are a number of distinctions that we consciously made, but I would say fundamentally at the beginning it was the need for a movement that could actually stop climate change in the ways and at the scale necessary.
It looks like the really high turnout of young people, over half of eligible young people could vote, did so in the presidential elections, and that assured that we would have Biden, who at least is moderately interested in climate change, rather than Trump, who opposes any environmental. So what do you think worked to mobilize that youth vote and to get youth involved in the movement?
For sure. I think voting is one tool in the toolbox, and youth certainly recognize that. And I think at the beginning, I will speak fundamentally from like personal experience, that Biden as the candidate was really disempowering as a young person, because he had previously been so clearly against progressive values and a vision, and really felt steeped in the tradition of old Democrats that like had gotten us into this mess in the first place. And so I do think part of his openness and his responsiveness to progressive movements for change was an integral part of young people showing up, right? Like changing his climate plan from what was once an F as rated by Sunrise to a bold vision that is now, as he states, like a top priority, especially within the first 100 days. And like we see him acting on it almost immediately, even within the transition team. And so I don't know that I have a definitive answer for this. I do think that grassroots movements for change were fundamental. I'm thinking about like the Frontline Coalition, which included the Working Families Party, folks who were working in Wisconsin and Michigan and Georgia and Pennsylvania to get out the vote and to really connect with young people and with historically underrepresented populations. And I also think even Sunrise, like phone banking for climate candidates that we cared about, like, oh my gosh, like Jamal Bowman, or other folks throughout. So I think there were like myriad factors, but I would fundamentally point to the work that grassroots movements did, despite being really disempowered by Biden's campaign early on in the primaries, to throw down to support him.
I've heard a lot that the way to reach people is you have to have personal contact. You have to knock on the doors, call, I guess, text. What's the psychological factor there? Why would you listen to me more if I phone you than if I give you a fact sheet or something?
I don't know that I can speak to the psychological factor, but I can certainly speak to the necessity of really connecting with folks. I've been reading a little bit about labor union organizing and thinking about how, folks are connected to their communities and to Fox News and to their televisions far more than they're ever going to be connected with real organizers who care about them and who like want to actually fight for things that they care about and to bring them into our vision. And so I think that those moments that we have the chance to connect with people and to say, what do you want to change in your communities, and how can we support the election of somebody who will change that? Or how can we support your community empowerment is integral, right? And like if we spend that time talking, much less reciting a fact sheet, then we're just working within a system that continually disempowers ordinary people to make change in their lives. And so I think that the times that I've been on the phone, like phone banking for folks like Charles Booker, and hearing these stories of people who really were in huge medical debt from one thing that went awry in their lives, and were burdened with this for the rest of their existence, right? And like this is why they needed Medicare for all, and they also needed a leader who they felt like cared that they needed Medicare for all. And if I was the envoy through which to explain, Charles Booker is going to care for you as an individual and is going to enact Medicare for all, then it made a huge difference. So I don't know if that answered your question per se, but I think that we don't give the average person enough credit for knowing what they need changed in their lives to make them better. And when we talk to them and when we articulate how that knowledge plays into our strategy, then we're empowering people and we're getting folks elected.
It makes sense to ask people what they need and want.
Yeah.
As a Kentuckian, why does Mitch McConnell keep getting elected when he's such he obscures, he opposes any kind of forward movement, even COVID relief, and instead appoints these conservative judges? I mean, that's not in the interests of Kentuckians, I think.
Yeah, but I would ask Chuck Schumer, why the Senate majority supports candidates who Kentuckians very clearly don't care about to get elected the first time, and who have said don't represent us. You know what I mean? I think that Mitch McConnell wins because his challengers have actually never connected with Kentuckians across the state and have been supported by outside entities far more than the state. And that gets them through the primaries, but that's never going to win a seat. And it's not going to hold a candle against a name that people know and that they trust, even if they've been screwed by. And so that is a question that I keep asking myself as well. But I unfortunately will have to blame the Democratic Party for that one.
So Amy McGrath was, it seemed like she'd be a fairly attractive fighter pilot mom. It sounds kind of intriguing. What was weak about her message or her supporters?
Amy McGrath fundamentally did not care about Kentuckians. She did not engage with us. She didn't respond when we said this is what's happening in our communities. We need you to take a bold stance on things like healthcare and abortion, and not go back and forth about whether you would have confirmed Brett Kavanaugh, right? Like, what Kentuckians need is not a weak vision, and a vision that sounds like the Democrats from 30 years ago who promised things that didn't deliver to communities across the state. What they need is like a real grassroots leader who has taken the time to invest. One who fundamentally grew up in a Kentucky community and understands what it means to be a Kentuckian and what values that is, but connects with other folks grounded in those values and is willing to fight for what people are telling him they need. And so I think that I'll just say that the Booker campaign gained many tens of points, right, in polling right before the election day. And I think that was despite huge deficits in funding and outside support, right? Like, we did not have $40 million to work with and squander. But it was a real grassroots campaign and movement and the the closeness of the race and the degree of support shows that that's the direction and the leader that Kentuckians need. So.
The Sunrise said that the leadership team is supermajority women because we knew that women and queer people push for holistic, intersectional solutions. They're willing to admit fault, leave ego behind, bring jokes, laughter, and joy to the movement. Do you think that there's like a danger of what I call the woman is wonderful school? Women are close to nature, to Mother Earth. But in fact, I don't know that they are any more morally superior or something like that to men. Or what's your feeling about the women are the best thing?
I think that I'm thinking a lot of I think it's like an Audre Lorde quote that like white women are the weakest link in resistance because they have like the closest proximity and desire to conform. Like that white women's resistance is grounded in a desire to hold the power of white men, not to like completely transform the system. I'm butchering the quote, but I think that's the essence of it. And I think that, again, speaking as an individual, I think that we have in the past years allowed, like, I think like Democrats, maybe not the left, but like moderate Democrats have allowed women to be glorified simply because of their gender identification. Right, like when we see, like sometimes I see on Twitter posts about how like female leaders are like the ones are the countries that are like doing better in XYZ, and it's solely attributed to the gender of their leader, and I think that fails to recognize the nuance that like female leaders can be colonists and imperialists and really like perpetuate harm to the same degree that men have. And yeah, so I think that all of that, going back to the quote, I think that Sunrise has a number of really strong, powerful women in charge. But I don't think that being a woman or even being queer makes up for other privileges that you might hold or ways that you are bringing your racial or class identity to the table and perhaps perpetuating other harm. So I think when I think about like justice and equity and anti-oppression, it means like we're having BIPOC voices lead the movement. We're having working class and poor identifying folks lead the movement. We are having queer folks lead the movement, but we're also having gender nonconforming or non-binary folks who are leading the movement, and folks of different neurological abilities who are not neurotypical or who might not be physically able in the ways that society thinks. I think all of those things are integral, and having leaders from who hold all of those marginalized identities leading the movement is integral, not just having women. Especially if they're white owning class women.
I think that the majority of white women voted for Trump, even in this election.
Yeah, I think so. I think white women are not. White women are voting for their interests as white people often, and as people with a lot of privilege, just as much as white men are.
Yeah, but Varshini says we knew that women and queer people push for holistic intersectional solutions. Is that because of there's something innate about their DNA, or is it because they're outsiders and they have a reason to push for change?
I don't think it's anything innate. I think like fundamentally women and queer people have been oppressed in society, but I think that what that maybe initial quote failed to recognize was the degrees of oppression that women and queer folks have experienced, and and that it's not enough to just have women and queer folks, that we need to think about the intersections of identity and like really promote folks who have been historically disenfranchised into leadership.
It is true that a multitude of studies show that women politicians tend to get more done and do more for their districts. They tend to be more more caring. So I've seen a million studies like that. And it's true that New Zealand and Germany having women leaders probably made a difference in their reaction to COVID and terrorism and all that stuff. So
yeah, but we have to ask if those are like a result of, like gender stereotypes, and it's, care work has historically been placed upon women. So it would make sense that they are fundamentally more caring when they've been asked to do care work for no money and no expectation for hundreds of years. So
for millennia, forever. All right. So I'm interested in some of the specific tactics. Like Sunrise did a tour of 15 cities in 2019. Were they doing trainings? Were they doing peppy rallies, or what was the focus of like if Sunrise goes to a new city?
Yeah, so I think that originally in 2019 we had thought that perhaps doing like a Green New Deal tour would be a really effective way with connecting with communities. And so that was one thing that we employed. I think our tactics have been evolving as we have evolved, right? We've learned how to best support hubs and are by no means perfect in doing so, but we are continually learning how to best do that. And yeah, so I think that I think tactics look different at a national and local level. Like I can start with our hubs. Our hubs engage in many ways, primarily through direct action, but also are really building coalitions with partners on the ground, and some are pushing for a local Green New Deal and doing so through direct action, but also perhaps through legislative means. Hubs are doing wide awakes. They're supporting a climate mandate. They're doing sit-ins, whatever it might be, right? Hubs are working autonomously in their communities in the ways and tactics that make the most sense to further the Green New Deal and a progressive vision, or maybe not a progressive vision, but a vision of climate justice in their communities. And nationally, I think that the tactics are constantly responding to that. And responding to that in the moment, right? This year, we were far more electorally focused than perhaps we have been in years past, doing phone banking and get out the vote work. But the year before, or 2 years, we were pushing back, right, against Nancy Pelosi by way of sit-ins, and really making climate change and specifically the Green New Deal a top priority for this year's election. So I think that, I don't actually think that we have one niche or tactic that we really employ constantly. I do think we evolve and change as the moment demands, and also as we learn about the movement.
You mentioned wide awakes. Is that where people make noise, bang drums in front of a recalcitrant politician like McConnell, or they did it in my area to a really conservative rice-growing member of Congress?
That is exactly what I mean, and that was actually grounded in practices from the abolitionist movement of the 19th century. And so that was something that we have done.
What are other tactics that have been drawn from history? I know that people a lot of time mention the Children's March and the Selma, Alabama, and the Civil Rights Movement. What are other kind of inspirations from studying the past?
Oh my gosh. I think there are so many. I think that often when I'm training and I think about the Civil Rights Movement or Standing Rock or other indigenous resistance movements, I always lead by saying that we recognize that we stand on the shoulders of giants, but are in no way trying to compare ourselves to them or co-opt their techniques. So yeah, I think a lot about drawing from the power and the organization of the lunch counter sit-ins, right? And the coordination and the intention behind them, and the way that they were prefiguratively showcasing the world that they wanted to see. But very clearly we don't have a point of intervention that is the same as a lunch counter. You know what I mean? There is no way to replicate exactly the lunch counter for the climate change or for the climate movement. And so we think about what the lunch counter symbolized and like the degree of dignity that and risk and sacrifice and yeah, just like what that action meant and what the strategy behind it, and like have taken lessons from that and adapted them to present day sit-ins or strikes or whatever it might be. So I think wide awakes are like a very clear example of a tactic that in history that worked right now and in this like current moment of the whirlwind. But we're actually not in a moment of the whirlwind. All of the movement theory folks would come after me for that one. But in this current moment, it was a slip of the tongue. But I don't actually know if I can point to like other very specific actions that are grounded in the same way.
Maybe being willing to go to jail to make a statement.
Yeah, absolutely.
The First Nation people and Gandhi's liberation movement are very focused on what Gandhi called soul force. Indigenous people use prayer and ritual and call on ancestors and are respectful to their elders and use the ceremony of the fire and that kind of thing. I wonder if any of that kind of soul force approach has been adapted.
Yeah, I think that Sunrise has really intentionally tried to craft a culture through singing and through storytelling, I think are the two things that come to mind. Unlike SNCC, we don't like start every single meeting with a song. That is a discipline that I think none of us have, but we certainly incorporate song into all of our actions, both to like bring joy and to bring like solidarity, most importantly, and to like bring in a vision. And I also think I think storytelling is not obviously not a practice that we came up with, but I think a lot about the way that storytelling, specifically like Marshall Gans and like public narrative and the farm workers movement, were able to connect with each other and with the broader public through storytelling and yeah, again, like build that solidarity. So I think that those are like two things that come front of mind, and I don't know if they're perhaps like soul searching within the movement, but there's certainly ways that we've built community and solidarity.
So what's an example of a story that you tell people as living in Appalachia, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, I think I think we tell stories at different times, right? So there are times that I talk about what it meant to grow up in Appalachia when I think about like how I grew to understand the importance of the Green New Deal, right? It was like by living here and by seeing the exploitation, and by thinking about like specific moments in my life that I understood that, and I have like really yet to hone in on how that story should be told. But I also think that there are times that are really low stakes that I tell stories about, moments when it was integral to be supported by a team, right? And like, what does it mean to build really strong team culture and community to me? And like thinking about random disparate experiences in my life that have meant a lot and that show that importance. So I think sometimes we think storytelling has to be like really high stakes, and it's always like, I survived a natural disaster and that's why I'm fighting for climate justice. But it's absolutely not. And it's about the everyday moments and interactions that we find important and valuable.
In terms of team building, which, as you say, is really crucial, in doing the interviews with people for the Climate Girls Changing Our World book, drama came up a lot. And that's like, this faction wants more power than this faction, or this person's getting more media attention than this person, or this person wants to hog the decision making. So primates do that kind of dominance, hierarchy, coalition building. It's part of our chimpanzee bonobo background. I think it must be integral to being primates. But I wonder what you see about issues like that and how to address them. because it's going to be inevitable, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think building teams is really tough, and something that I've actually been doing through Sunrise is like doing a transformative justice cohort, which I don't know if you're super familiar with, but is it's the ways that we. I'm not going to do a great definition right now. Actually, maybe I have one right here, but it's the ways that we as individuals operate through like a long-term and generational understanding of violence and like mitigate harm outside of carceral structures and systems, but also, yeah, like how we mitigate harm in our own everyday interactions. And it's a framework to do so, and to handle conflict well through our community mechanisms. And I think that in many like social movements or in progressive spaces, we like to think that like we can avoid harm, or we can like create a culture that is like so sound that there's never going to be conflict. And conflict is like phenomenal. Lean into conflict. I'm trying to, like, it's not my personality type, but conflict is integral. But I do think that harm is also inevitable when you're bringing together, especially a multiracial cross-class movement. And what is important is like, and I don't think that Sunrise is there yet, and many movements aren't there yet, but like figuring out the structures that we can have in place to mitigate that harm and to really reconcile it in the ways that are necessary, and to learn from it and to create values and more structures that will respond to it in the future. So
what's an example of, what do you mean by structure?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of some kind of conflict that's occurred and how a structure was designed to harmonize or resolve the conflict?
Yeah, I think a lot. I once worked on a team that was like both volunteer. I was one of the volunteers, and like staff focused, and there was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of conflict around like class and class background while on that team, and I remember very clearly like moments in which like individuals of more class privilege were like really not conscious of the impact that like asking people to, for example, to say like, oh, you can just pay for your travel, like we need you to come back, and like without an understanding that was not a possibility. And that's not an extreme example, but right, like prolonged lack of recognition of the impact of class on a team can really make a difference. And so I think that the way that was mediated was through like kind of a transformative justice space in which that harm was like really openly discussed with the facilitator, and then like processed to the degree that it could be, and apologies were made to the degree that they needed to be, or that the victims would accept them to be or asked for them to be. And then we created like, ways to move forward that were grounded in like, principles and values that would both that would not obviously like mean there would be no harm in the future, but made all parties cognizant of the way in which harm had occurred and like how to avoid it in the future, or like ways to mitigate it and to confront it head on. So that's like a very small, I think, example, but I think that especially on a team, or especially in a movement that is constantly working between staff and volunteer, harm is inevitable because of the way that power interacts and the way that, just like humans interact, especially when you're working under a timeline of like stopping climate change, or when you think that that mission is like, of the utmost importance. And so I don't know what specific structures are going to look like in the future, but even just having like mediated spaces for conflict are integral.
You know, I was in a really very wonderfully structured feminist group. And one of the things we did at the end was go around and people did kind of an evaluation, a check-in. So that was time for people to speak up about anything unresolved. Just having the space for everyone to speak up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think that there are ways that we can integrate values, and ways that we can think about our communication with each other that can mitigate harm, right? Like thinking about how urgency in our work can harm our culture and can increases the risk of harm and the degree to which harm happens, right? So like if we find ways to think about how to make our culture less urgent and less, really less urgent, then maybe we will also mitigate harm. So it's like I think it's a lot of different components.
What about the pretty common theme of jealousy? You're getting more media attention than me. Who do you think you are?
I think like that is something that I think was really like a huge part of the youth climate movement as a whole, especially in a movement like with celebrity activists who emerged like very early on. And I would say that like, yeah, in Sunrise, I think we prioritize doing the work, not getting the media attention. And I would say that, yeah, in my interactions, that has not been a conflict. Or like jealousy has not impeded our ability to work together as individuals, or to like come together as a movement. And I think that is like a fundamental dedication to a broader vision as opposed to like our own personal stake in it, or stake in like self-promotion within that vision. But I'll say frankly that like working with other youth movements for change, that is certainly not the case.
In that there is that kind of competition?
Yeah, I think that's, and I think that is a real direct result of teenagers who have become famous through the youth climate movement and who have like made it through the youth climate movement and become influencers. But like, frankly, are they doing the work by going to COP25? No, right? Like, that's not actually organizing on the ground, or like doing Levi's campaigns is not organizing on the ground. That is like that was the first company that came to mind because I know they're doing like sustainable initiatives. I don't actually know if anyone has done that, but right, like those, or even like being on MSNBC is not the epitome of the work. The epitome of the work is like having one-on-one conversations with folks in our community and like bringing them into the movement. And I think Sunrise does a really good job through a theory of change of orienting people towards that importance as opposed to the celebrity activism importance.
Mm-hmm. When we think of celebrity, we think of Greta Thunberg, and the interesting thing is that she doesn't really seek it or want it. So it's kind of an interesting phenomena that she's the star and doesn't, especially.
I would say, I think in the U.S. there are other stars.
Like?
Yeah, I won't name names, but I think that there are there are folks who have started other youth climate orgs and movements, who certainly have become very famous as a result.
Okay, so you're saying it's not really an issue in Sunrise because the focus is on doing the work on the grassroots level.
Yeah, and I think that, I think fundamentally we do not see success or even put like a huge value on who gets media attention. It's about what is actually being done.
Yeah, well, that's logical, but often humans aren't. You've kind of focused, because of your age, on organizing curriculum for secondary school students. So what kind of approach have you found works there? And when you're building curriculum, what is it going to teach me if I'm a middle school student? What am I going to learn from your curriculum?
Yeah, so I think that I'll answer the second question first. When we built curriculum to support new organizers, we thought about getting them oriented towards Sunrise. Like, what is our theory of change? Like, what is people power, political power, the people's alignment? What do those things mean? And then it's like, what does it actually mean to be a mass protest movement or structure-based organizing movement, or a merriment of both? Like, what are those tools and techniques and escalation, and like, what is our history there? So I think that's like one big bucket. Another bucket is like, what does it take to like facilitate a good meeting? We're terrible at facilitating meetings naturally. Like, how do you keep people engaged? How do you actually like recruit people in a way that is outside of your social circle and is like gonna be equitable and reach the people that you want it to? How do you absorb people from a meeting? How do you plan an action? Right, like all of these things that are so, or how do you do a one-on-one? A huge part of organizing, right? All of these, like, I think when I think of our curriculum, I think of it as like a merriment of skills and like of really hard conversations about history and about power and about theory, right? That like, contrary to popular belief, middle and high schoolers are more than ready to engage in the same way that the rest of the movement is. We just have to make it accessible and make it applicable, right? Like if we're talking about experiences that are only going to be accessible to a college student or beyond, then it makes sense that our training is not going to like land or like sink in to middle and high schoolers. But if we're talking about the way that power interacts in our school systems, then like that's a really clear visual. So that's a lot of what we were thinking about and a lot of what we talked about.
In our previous interview, you said that high school students have to learn not to always have to ask for permission. There's an authority. How explain that?
Yeah, no, I think that it's huge for middle and high school students, and I actually think that this is a societal issue. But I think specifically for middle and high school students, everything up until the point that we begin organizing in our lives has been things that we've had to ask permission for. Like even so much as like going to the bathroom in school, right? I think I used the word that like students have like learned helplessness because of the environment that we have been put in.
Mm.
And so I think a huge initial part of our curriculum was like agitating folks, like actually like the way that we create change is not by asking permission from our principal to walk out. It's by saying like we're going to walk out whether you want us to or not. And like accepting the consequences of that and saying that they are nothing or maybe not as important as like the mission itself. But I will say like more broadly speaking, I think that like we have a culture and a society that like disempowers the ordinary individual. And so I actually like think that everybody probably would benefit from real like agitation about power and what does it mean to seize power and take power, and like it's okay to want power, right? And like, yeah, what does it mean to like really have agency?
What I heard from a lot of people in the book is that part of the reason that girls are at the forefront of the climate movement is because high school boys are more afraid of being considered uncool or hugging, being a tree hugger or a hippie were some of the words that people used. So I wonder if you find gender differences in terms of willingness to be an activist for climate change, in terms of boys, I should be in a band and in sports, and that's how I'd be cool.
Honestly, I don't know. I think like most people in Sunrise like have a very developed sense of self. So I'm like, maybe like I think we all at the end of the day like are like seeking approval in some ways and like have like that's just like a human thing. I don't know, I'm not an expert, but I'm like we all have like natural desires to like be a part of the in group and whatever it is. But I'm like, I don't know. I think that like I guess I did work on like an all-female team, but I don't see like huge gaps in gender in Sunrise in the slightest. I'm like, maybe like the men are more earnest than those that you would interact with in everyday life. I was joking about this with a friend. I was like, everybody is very earnest, and like certainly most high school boys are not earnest to like a scary degree. But I don't know. I think maybe that's a culture in local communities more than it's a culture in like Sunrise is like a national organization, if that makes sense.
Oh,
like
yeah, absolutely.
Our hub in Lexington is like very female and non-binary identifying, and like maybe it's because it was started by folks who identified as being female or non-binary, but maybe it really does play into it. I don't know. I really don't.
Well, the fact is that there are many more young women involved in terms of every organization that I know of that's youth-led climate, many more women. So something is going on that keeps boys out.
Who knows? Maybe it is like toxic masculinity and like internalized patriarchy. It certainly could and probably is.
Yeah, I do think there's more fear on boys' part of being ostracized, or it's that old thing that it's okay for a girl to be a tomboy, but it's not okay for a boy to be a sissy. So there's more pressure on boys to conform and prove their masculinity, and being a tree hugger might make their masculinity suspect.
I could certainly see that as the reality. I don't know that I've like ever had an interaction that confirmed that, per se. You know what I mean? Like nothing specific is coming to mind, but certainly I do think, I think to a degree, the ways. I also think that like the ways in which sometimes people are socialized into becoming an activist in high school, are like. Yeah, they skew like very feminine in many ways. Like I think, it just like when we think about like clubs or leadership or extracurricular activities in that way, or even like social media usage and like the way that it is used, those could all be contributing factors.
So it's okay for young women to be caring, and not so okay for boys to be caring.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking I interviewed Halal in Turkey, and she said in their 20s, they're more young men that are involved. So there's something about the pressure in high school years to really prove your masculinity or whatever, and it eases as they get older.
Yeah, and I mean, I do think like when we think about who has historically led the left, right? It has, unfortunately, or maybe like not, maybe no judgment attached. It has historically been men. You know what I mean? I'm like, even I just watched like the Frida Kahlo movie for the first time. Like even when we think about like who sat at the table drinking tequila and talking about communism, it was like ultimately Diego Rivera, not Frida. And so it's, like what does that say?
What about another issue that comes up a lot is burnout. With school work and working outside the home for many teens in the U.S. and U.K., how do you teach people in your curriculum to do self-help, it's called?
Yeah. I think that ideally we are supporting people to build hubs that I don't think are immune to people's burnout, but create a community where people can ask for help and support in a way that allows them to step back before burnout, really.
My question was, are there structures built in to say, how are you feeling? What's up with you?
I don't think there are structures per se. But I do think that there are, I don't think there are structures, but I do think that hubs create relationships that allow them to do that. Ideally, and like you have mentorship as well as like flat relationships that are going to check in with folks. And yeah, there are going to be ways that like teams can be structured so that multiple people can be working on projects in a way that like allows people to step forward and step back.
Did you and do you have a mentor, and do you have a mentee?
I do not have a mentee per se. I think that like we are working on leadership development within a local context and a hub context. I do like I have I like will have a mentor for front loading work, but I have had folks who have like taken on mentorship roles for me and like really supported at different times. So.
Define front loading again, please.
Front loading is like a process of reevaluation, both strategically, structurally, and story based and like narrative based that momentum based organizations undergo. So it is like, yeah, it's like evaluation and then like reimagination of what a movement will look like.
And what are some of the issues that are coming up now? Like we want to change this and we need to work on that, and let's do that. What are the issues that are prevalent now?
Yeah, it's like thinking about what, how does Sunrise nationally interact with our hubs and best support them, and like what structures facilitate that, but also like what strategy prioritizes local initiatives as well as like national ones, or like what parts of our strategy so far do we want to lean into. And then I think it's like questions of like, how has the narrative we've crafted been like inclusive of historically marginalized folks, and how has it been like very clearly not inclusive? And so I think that there are like, I think it's questions on many different fronts that, we're grappling with.
What are you thinking is going to be the focus in 2021?
I have no idea quite yet. I think that some of it will be perhaps in response to the current administration, but I think like one thing that I've been hearing a lot of excitement around and like support around is the idea of like local and statewide Green New Deals and what enacting that looks like.
How many hubs are there now? Last I heard was 500.
Oh my goodness. I have maybe no idea. Maybe 500 is right. Like there are hubs that are registered and in the map, and there are hubs that are just like popping up. So yeah, I think like maybe 300 is a better ballpark. I truly do not know. We could look on the website.
Okay. When you are, this is your last year in high school, so when you go to university, what are you thinking about how your activism will change or morph?
I would like to continue doing this work. Who knows if I'll like go straight to college or to university. And like might take a gap year before. But I think that like we have really strong hubs and activism on campus, and they're universities like communities, or like Lexington, like a traditional community, are like important places to mobilize. So I think in many ways I'll still be doing the same work that I'm doing right now, depending on the campus that I end up on.
Plus a lot of schoolwork. Right now, or in a typical month, let's say, how many hours do you spend a week on organizing?
Probably like 10 to 15. Like some weeks it's closer to 20 probably, but yeah.
And what do you personally do to keep from burning out?
I really like try to intentionally sleep and exercise and like take time for myself and journal, and do all those things and like set like clear boundaries and limits. I think it's okay to say no to things and to know your own capacity, and I think it's like actually a very important part of like being a leader to show that you like set boundaries, because it then gives permission for other folks to and keeps them from burning out. So.
And you play the piano too.
I do play the piano. Yeah.
Is that restorative for you? I guess because you have to think about something totally different.
I do find it restorative. I think that I do think I think playing the piano as perhaps a hobby would be more restorative. You know what I mean? As opposed to like a requirement of my mother. But I do certainly find it to be enjoyable and restorative.
Good. So coalitions is part of like progressive thinking, that we work together with other networks. What kind of coalitions does Sunrise work with, is a part of?
Yeah, we work with like the Green New Deal Network very heavily to think about what does it mean to push for the Green New Deal. I was involved with the Youth Climate Strike Coalition, which coordinated youth-focused climate movements.
Wait, stay with that one for a minute. I heard that the national ended for the Youth Climate Strike movement, and they're local groups, but not national.
So that was that's a specific organization that's called U.S. Youth Climate Strike. Their national component did dissolve.
Do you know why?
I just think that it like wasn't achieving what they had hoped it would, and like they knew that as a decentralized movement they would have a lot of power. I don't know though specifics, but they were a part of a broader coalition called the Youth Climate Strike Coalition, which includes, I think it's like maybe 8 youth movements for climate justice. And so those are like 2 coalitions. I think one that has evolved over the past months is the Count on Us coalition, which is like March for Our Lives, United We Dream, Dream Defenders, and Sunrise, and that is of course a broader generational coalition for change as opposed to a climate-centric one. And then of course we partner and participate as necessary to really like strategically get things done. Those are just the 3 that came front of mind. I'm sure that there are many more.
So does U.S. Climate Strike have local chapters, or what do they call them?
Yeah, we have a chapter in Kentucky. It's very strong, and I do policy for that. But they are called chapters.
And what do you mean that you do policy?
I'm technically the policy director in Kentucky, but
so that means you help formulate what kind of issues you want to focus on. Yeah,
and it changes. This year that focused a lot on like endorsements locally, or like legislative fights, but yeah. So I think that their chapters are certainly very strong. I know that in other states they're doing a lot of incredible organizing.
Do they coordinate in Zoom calls or anything like that, or is it totally on your own?
I think it's completely decentralized. I'm not sure. I'm not a chapter lead, so they might be in more communication.
Okay. Then another question is, do you think that XR style tactics, like, very dramatic, red to symbolize as blood and gluing themselves to gates and stuff, really famous in the UK, does Sunrise adopt any of those kind of very dramatic statements?
We do not employ them in the same way that XR does. I think that's like an aesthetic choice and a strategic choice, but I don't think it's necessarily a critique. Like if there is XR in the United States, and I think if hubs wanted to do XR actions, then they would support XR to do them. But we do not generally engage in that kind of action.
Why?
I think that I think it was a strategic choice for how we pursue a Green New Deal here. And I think that, I think there are like myriad direct action techniques, and we assessed that like it was far more strategic to have a narrative of like building an army of young people to stop climate change, as opposed to maybe more theatrical techniques.
Say a word about, there's 11 parts of the platform for Sunrise. What is that called, and what's the purpose?
So we have principles. They are like guiding. They're kind of guiding tenets for our movement. However, they were just modified, and I believe that they're now. I want to say 13, but I can confirm that right now. But they are, yeah, they're really like simply what we ground ourselves in our work, and we introduce them to new hubs, and they're like they're 12 now, but
And what's the new one?
We modified a few, but we added "We fight for the liberation of all people."
Okay. If you were going to pick two that you think are the most foundational, that really are signatures for Sunrise, what would they be if you could do that?
I think the first one is like we are a movement to stop climate change and create millions of good paying jobs in the process. And our mission has changed and evolved as time has progressed, but I think that certainly was a really grounding force, especially at the beginning, and still very much so is in many ways. And I also think that I think "We fight for the liberation of all people" was really integral in distinguishing ourselves from the environmental movement of the past and its shortcomings. And I think especially integral over the past few months.
Yeah, I think people say that what characterizes Gen Z activism is social justice. They're not concerned just about the mechanics of climate change, but how it affects people intersectionally. So that justice piece is really characteristic of your Generation Z.
Yeah, absolutely.
Finishing up here, Biden has been really reluctant. He doesn't really say he supports the Green New Deal. He says he supports climate change. He has Kerry as his climate czar. What kind of tactics are you thinking about to make him develop a little further towards commitment to a Green New Deal?
Sure. So we just released a call for a climate mandate, an Office of Climate Mobilization, with cabinet members such as like Representative Deb Haaland, who would be really integral in pursuing that mission. I do think it is like worth noting that the Biden plan has real shortcomings, but it's also the most progressive climate plan put forth ever by a presidential candidate. And I think at the very least holding him to all components of that plan within the first 100 days or a strong commitment to it is a huge part, right? Like I think if that plan were to be enacted, it would be a huge step. And I think it's like, yeah, I think ensuring that there are folks and allies who are ready to keep pushing for that, and to say like your election is the start of the fight, not the end of it, is like the most important thing that we can be doing.
And Kamala Harris was one of the first sponsors of the Green New Deal, so it helps that she's right there talking with him on a daily basis. Yeah. What resources are online if someone wanted to learn more about Sunrise? And could you say a word about the new book from Sunrise?
Yeah. So Winning the Green New Deal is it's really about a framework for the vision of a Green New Deal that we seek, and the ways that we think about it in terms of both personal stories and also like legislative visions and community visions. I am actually just now reading it, but it's very grounding in the way that we think about the Green New Deal. And I think that if folks wanted to learn more about Sunrise, certainly start with like the website that has great information about who we are, Theory of Change, and then I think fundamentally connecting with local hubs on the ground. And they all look different and they take different shapes. But I think that they are like the real iteration of Sunrise and like where the real work is happening. And so I think connecting with them.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else that you would like to add in terms of how to win this fight for climate change upon which our lives depend?
I think like communities know what they need and have been calling for for decades and for generations. And it's our job to support that vision and to facilitate it and to not compromise on it, and to know that stopping climate change requires a reevaluation of our entire society and like transformation of it, and that we're not going to stop climate change under the frame of capitalism and racism and colonization, and it's really going to take a reckoning and an overhaul of those systems to win. And I don't think we can claim victory until we do that.
When you look at history, what, people always refer to the Chenoweth book that says you only need 3.5% of the population to support you, and then you can make change. I know Sunrise is influenced by that book. Do you think that's realistic? I mean, if we get 3.5, then we're going to have a revolution?
I don't know. I think I am constantly building towards 3.5, but I also think that there's no magic number, and there's also, if we hit 3.5% and all we get is a watered down Green New Deal that is simply about renewable energy, then we won't really have won. So I think that we need to be bringing as many people and communities as possible into our vision for a Green New Deal and to fight for it. But I don't think there's a magic number, and I don't think there's a magic solution. And I don't know that it means, I don't know if numbers mean anything if we aren't held together in real solidarity.
Great. Thank you, Lily.